and came back and told him all of this. David said to his men,
"Every man strap on his sword."
And every one of them strapped on their sword. David also strapped on his sword, and about 400 men went up after David, while 200 remained with the baggage. But one of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife,
David sent messengers out of the wilderness to greet our master, and he shouted insults at them. Yet the men were very good to us, and we suffered no harm, and we never missed anything when we were in the fields, as long as we were with them. They were a wall to us, both night and by day, and all the while we were with them, keeping the sheep. Now therefore know this, and consider what you should do, for evil has been decided against our master, and against all his house. He is so ill-natured that no one can speak to him.
Then Abigail hurried and took 200 loaves, 2 skins of wine, 5 sheep ready dressed, 5 measures of parched grain, 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of figs. She loaded them on donkeys and said to her young men,
"Go on ahead of me. I am coming after you."
But she did not tell her husband Nabal, and she rode on a donkey and came down under cover of the mountain. David and his men came down toward her, and she met them. Now David said to them,
"Surely it was in vain that I protected all that this fellow has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that belonged to him. But he has returned me evil for good. God do so to David, and more also, if by morning I leave so much as one male of all who belong to him."
When Abigail saw David, she hurried and alighted from her donkey and fell before David on her face, bowing to the ground. She fell at his feet and said,
"Upon me alone, my Lord, be the guilt. Please let your servant speak in your ears and hear the words of your servant. My Lord, do not take seriously this ill-natured fellow, Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But I, your servant, did not see the young men of my Lord whom you sent. Now then, my Lord, as the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, since the Lord has restrained you from blood guilt and from taking vengeance with your own hand, now let your enemies and those who seek to do evil to my Lord be like Nabal. And now let this present that your servant has brought to my Lord be given to the young men who follow my Lord. Please forgive the trespass of your servant, for the Lord will certainly make my Lord a sure house, because my Lord is fighting the battles of the Lord, and evil shall not be found in you so long as you live. If anyone should rise up to pursue you and to seek your life, the life of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of the living under the care of the Lord your God. But the lives of your enemies he shall sling out from the hollow of a sling. When the Lord has done to my servant according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you, and has appointed you prince over Israel, my Lord shall have no cause of grief or pangs of conscience for having shed blood without cause, or for having saved himself. And when the Lord has dealt well with my Lord, then remember your servant."
David said to Abigail,
"Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you to meet me today. Blessed be your good sense, and blessed be you, who have kept me today from blood guilt and from avenging myself by my own hand. For as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, who has restrained me from hurting you, unless you had hurried and come to meet me, truly by morning there would not have been left to Nabal so much as one male."
Then David received from her hand what she had brought him. He said to her,
"Go up to your house in peace. See, I have heeded your voice, and I have granted your petition."
When I saw that humility was going to be the topic for this morning a couple weeks ago, I thought to myself, well, who better to talk about that? The story of David and Nabal is sort of a worst-case scenario, showing what happens when pride disrupts shalom. David assumes that he and his men deserve a reward for protecting Nabal's property, so David tells Nabal he expects a feast to be made for him and his men. Nabal is known as a stubborn man, a surly man, they said this morning. He doesn't really appreciate being told by a stranger what exactly he is supposed to do, so he insults David, and the two are set off on a violent confrontation. Now, while this may be sort of a worst-case scenario, perhaps put yourself in either one of those positions and maybe see how easily something like this could happen for any of us. Imagine a stranger showing up and mowing your lawn without your knowledge, and then knocking on your door and saying, "Feed me, I mowed your lawn." Or imagine that you were owed something by someone, and when you went to them to ask for it, you were just told off. It seems kind of obvious that violence would be inevitable, maybe not for us, but for those who had tremendous egos, for those who had tremendous resources, violence might be inevitable. And thankfully, Abigail intervenes, and when neither of the men could see what was going on around them, could really understand the situation well, Abigail intervenes. She restores peace. I'm not quite sure I would call it shalom at that point. So obviously the main issue is pride. On a very basic level, pride is when we elevate ourselves above others, including God. And then humility is the opposite, in which we lower ourselves in relation to others and God. I don't know that there's much more to say about that. I think we get it, right? We understand this dynamic between pride and humility. We understand what those two things are and how they function. And I'll just briefly go through some of the scriptures that help us see how these are themes throughout our texts. In Deuteronomy 8, God warns the people of Israel as they're working their way towards the promised land to remember God and remember God's provision, because it's possible that when they become wealthy in the land flowing with milk and honey, that they will convince themselves that it was all their doing. Sure enough, that plays itself out multiple times with the people and with kings. King Uzziah was blessed because of his obedience. And then sure enough, in 2 Chronicles 26, we read that once he became powerful, his pride led to his downfall. Most of us know the proverb that says pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. So then the Proverbs advise humility. When pride comes, then comes destruction, but with humility comes wisdom. Jesus tells the story of the religious leader that prays, "Oh Lord, thank you that I am not like the evil men all around me, including this tax collector. See the good things that I do, Lord?" Then the tax collector prays, "Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner." Jesus declares that it's the tax collector's prayer that is heard by God. And then he says that everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. And we see Jesus modeling that throughout his ministry. Imagine God Almighty, all-powerful God, coming to earth, being born as a human. The Creator becoming the thing of the creation. What a tremendous act of humility. In Matthew 20:28 says that Jesus came not to be served, but to serve. And he does this throughout his ministry. He heals people. He washes his disciples' feet. He goes to the cross. He lives and he dies as the servant of all. So this is why Paul encourages the Philippian church to be humble, valuing others above themselves, because Jesus is the example. Jesus, who humbled himself, he did not see having the power of God as something to be exploited. He lowered himself. He took the form of a slave. So we've heard this. We know that this is an important part of our scriptures. Humility is actually an aspect of Almighty God. We know this as a way that we can and should follow in Jesus' footsteps. It's not new. This is not a new concept. I think the challenge is that we oftentimes don't know how to assess our own standing in relation to pride and humility. C.S. Lewis wrote about pride, "There is no fault which makes someone so unpopular, and no fault which we are more unconscious of in ourselves." There is no fault which makes someone so unpopular, and no fault which we are more unconscious of in ourselves. So it's here that I want to inject an important verse from Romans 12. Paul writes to all the Roman churches. He says, "Do not consider yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment, in accordance with the faith God has given each of you." Consider yourself, Paul says. Think of yourself. The assumption is that we will consider ourselves. We will think of ourselves. But isn't this the main issue? How often do we consider ourselves and our situations with sober judgment? How often do we consider ourselves at all? I've told the story before about how I was confronted by a friend during college that informed me painfully that I wasn't very fun to be around sometimes, especially when I got to joking around, because I had a tendency to be kind of a jerk. It was a shock to learn that while I thought I was playful and hilarious, others thought I was just plain mean. I hadn't considered myself soberly or accurately. And I think one of the other challenges in our context is the assumption that just simply thinking of ourselves, considering ourselves, is the opposite of humility. So I've witnessed a Mennonite practice in which some of us don't consider ourselves at all, because any thought of ourselves is just too close to pride. I remember being at a church retreat and having an intergenerational gathering of small groups. And we had about 8 people around a circle, and one of our tasks was to just share with each other, name one thing, name 2 things perhaps that we believed that were gifts that God had given to us that we can share with our community, or that we have shared, just things that we might be good at, things that we are energized by, things that are things that we can offer to the congregation, and to name those really in a helpful way. And there were so many people around my circle who could not bring themselves to name it. And they said as much. I was told not to talk about myself. I was taught to be humble, meaning I don't talk about myself. It's too close to pride. And we had a really, really difficult discussion to try to figure out, well, how do we affirm each other? How do we name our gifts when us as individuals are supposed to just not consider ourselves because we're just getting that much closer to pride? It was a practice that was deeply ingrained, and I think those folks that had a hard time naming still, even after the discussion, I think would have said they couldn't really name. They didn't want to name for fear of being caught in pride. They wouldn't want to name what what they were good at, what they loved, what they could offer to the church. Paul tells the Roman churches not to undervalue themselves or devalue themselves, but to soberly consider themselves. And when we consider ourselves, we do it in relation to God. So ideally, when we consider ourselves primarily in relation to God, hopefully we understand that we sit in between this and hold this dual nature of being blessed and being broken. That we are the beloved creations of God, and we are in need of healing. Then as we consider others, hopefully we see the same thing. We see people who are created by God, who bear God's image, but are also broken, who are in need. And we see that we do not have these higher and lower. We are all in relation to God on the same plane. From out of that, we choose, like Jesus, to take a subordinate role for the good of the other. That's the most basic level I would hope that we can realize. The most basic level of consideration of ourselves, that we are blessed and we are broken, that others are blessed and are broken and are loved by the same Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer God. Hopefully that keeps us from overinflating ourselves and from devaluing ourselves, also from devaluing others. And on a more regular basis, on a more daily basis, I would invite us to find time to consider ourselves, to think about ourselves, not in a vain way, but in an honest and sober way. I truly believe one of the best things we can do for our own personal growth is to learn how to carefully evaluate ourselves. It's so easy to go about daily life without ever stopping to assess ourselves, to look at the bigger picture of what's going on around us. But it can be so harmful to others and ourselves if we avoid it. We go in, hopefully, for regular health checkups, for dental checkups, for car maintenance. But how often do we do a regular self-assessment? It's hard work. And I don't know that we even know how to do it. If I were to say, do a self-assessment, would you even know where to begin? Some people in leadership theory like to talk about going to the balcony. They talk about this metaphor of being, on the dance floor and interacting with all these people, and then at some point going up to the balcony so that you can get a picture from above, see what all is going on. Maybe in our context, we shouldn't talk about a dance floor, we can talk about a potluck or something, but the idea being that we recognize that we are part of a vast array of people and behaviors and experiences, and the only perspective we have is our own, right? I mean, the only voice that we hear truly and clearly, the only eyes that we see with is our own. And it can be beneficial, I would say necessary, to find a way to mentally pull ourselves back a little bit, go to the balcony so that we can step back, we can see maybe kind of objectively, how have we been behaving with other people, right? Because we're always right? I mean, we're always right in our interactions, right? David knew that he was right, and Nabal knew that he was right? And Abigail knew that both of them were wrong. So sometimes it takes a different person's perspective to help us understand where we are. And I think we can do that ourselves as well. I think we can take time to take a step back, to look at the bigger picture of what's going on and see how we can continue to grow. Imagine if David and Nabal had just taken a moment to step back from their situation and ask of themselves a couple questions. Like, what's going on right now? What's happening? What role am I playing in making this tension worse? Am I preserving shalom or am I disturbing it? And what changes do I need to make? Because I can't control the other person in the situation. Right? That's why Paul says, as much as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. You are the one who chooses your responses and your behaviors. So I didn't put it, Mabel and Tilly put this purple sheet in your bulletin that is hopefully a helpful guide. And I would encourage you to take a look at it at some point in the next couple days, in the next couple weeks, to find some time to, maybe this can be your prayer practice, to take a pause at the end of the day, to think back over your day. Imagine that you are sort of having an out-of-body experience and you're looking down on yourself or looking upon yourself and all the interactions you've been having, and do some self-assessment. So there's questions on there, like really basic questions, like what happened today? What happened this week? What events stick out in my mind? How did I respond? How did I feel? What was I thinking? What did I say? What did I do? How do the words that I spoke, how did my actions reflect the fruit of the Spirit from Galatians 5? Love and joy and peace and patience and gentleness and self-control. How did my actions and behaviors reflect those or not? What can I do to pursue and promote shalom in this situation? And how might I act with more humility in the future? This is just a guide, because I get the sense that, well, I certainly don't know how to do it very well, but I get the sense that self-assessment is just something that we don't know how to do very well. So I invite you, please, try this out. See what kinds of realizations you have. See what kinds of messages you get from the Spirit as the Spirit helps you to figure these things out. This is really hard work, right? Being honest with ourselves is difficult, but I think it's a necessary starting point for true humility and subsequently for shalom. When Paul encourages the churches in Rome in chapter 14 to live in harmony with one another, or you could say to live in shalom with one another, the starting point is to not be proud or conceited, but to associate with those who are supposedly lower than you are. May we follow the example of Jesus in humility. May we think of ourselves, and may we think of ourselves accurately and soberly, so that we might promote and live out shalom. Amen.